The crystal chandeliers of the grand ballroom at the exquisite Plaza Hotel in New York City cast a fractured golden light over 300 of the city's wealthiest, their laughter chiming like expensive glass against the soft undercurrent of a string quartet. Standing beside a towering marble pillar, almost invisible in his dark navy dress uniform, was Lieutenant David Miller of Engine Company 55. He wasn't there to mingle. He was working a mandatory overtime security detail for the Heroes in High Society Gala, a fundraiser whose irony wasn't lost on him. David, at 34, carried a quiet, almost granite-like heaviness in his posture, a stoicism forged in the intense heat of Chicago fires before he transferred east 7 years ago. His eyes, usually sharp and assessing for hazards, were currently fixed on a point above the crowd, trying to tune out the cloying scent of heavy perfumes and the self-congratulatory speeches. He hated these events, preferred the honest grime of the firehouse to the polished veneer of this world where money was discussed, louder than anything else. A few feet away, holding court with a tumbler of aged scotch in one hand and gesturing expansively with the other, stood Joshua Jackson. At 48, Jackson was a hedge fund titan whose ego was inflated far beyond his already substantial net worth. He was wearing a bespoke Tom Ford tuxedo that cost more than David's car, and his face was already flushed with too much expensive alcohol and the intoxicating power of being the richest man in most rooms he entered. The incident began with something trivial, as these things often do. Jackson, spinning around to emphasize a point about market volatility to a sycophantic junior partner, stumbled slightly. A splash of amber liquid sloshed from his glass, landing squarely on the impeccable stripe of David's uniform trousers. David didn't flinch. He merely glanced down and then back up, his expression neutral. A normal person would have apologized. Joshua Jackson, however, saw the world through a lens where he was never clumsy, only inconvenienced by lesser beings. He looked at the firefighter with undisguised disdain, his lip curling. "Watch where you're standing, you overgrown Boy Scout," Jackson snapped, his voice loud enough to slice through the nearby conversations. The string quartet seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second. David remained perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back in parade rest. "My apologies, sir," David said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. It was the wrong thing to say to a man used to absolute deference. Jackson's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer, invading David's personal space, the smell of scotch pungent on his breath. "Excuse me," Jackson emphasized the rank with sneering sarcasm. "You're here paid by my taxes and my donations to stand still and look decorative, not to talk back. God, you first responders, are all alike, all brute force and zero grace." A nervous titter ran through the small circle that had formed around them. Jackson and his fiancée, a sleek socialite named Sarah Thompson who looked bored by everything, sighed dramatically. "Joshua Darlett, don't waste your breath. He probably doesn't even understand half the words you're using." That stung more than Jackson's insult. David's jaw tightened almost He remembered a time when his feet wore Italian leather dance shoes, not steel-toed regulation boots. He remembered a life before the tragedy in Chicago that had sealed his heart inside a bunker. Jackson, sensing he'd struck a nerve and delighted by the audience, pressed his advantage. He gestured vaguely at the polished dance floor where a few couples were swaying to a slow waltz. "Look at that. Refinement." He turned back to David, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Tell you what, Hero, I'm feeling generous tonight. I'll make you a bet." He raised his voice, ensuring the surrounding tables could hear. He paused for dramatic effect, then added the kicker with a drunken laugh. "Hell, if you can actually dance, I'll marry you myself right here on this spot." The ballroom went silent. The string quartet actually stopped playing this time. 300 heads turned toward the corner where the billionaire was publicly baiting the firefighter. It was a grotesque spectacle, wealth punching down at service. David felt the blood rushing to his ears, a hot flush rising from his collar. Hiwa was frozen not by fear of Jackson, but by the sudden, violent collision of his past and present. 8 years ago, David Miller hadn't just been a firefighter. He had been one half of a nationally ranked amateur ballroom dancing duo. He and his wife, Laura Perez, had floated across floors just like this one. But Laura had died in an apartment blaze 7 years ago, a fire David's own company had responded to. He hadn't been able to reach her in time. Since that night, he hadn't stepped on a dance floor. He had buried that part of himself with her, convinced that grace and beauty had no place in a world that could burn so his alley. To dance now, here, as a circus act for this man's amusement, felt like a desecration of her memory. Jackson mistook the silence for cowardice. What's the matter, Lieutenant? Cut your tongue, or are you just realizing you're out of your depth? Sarah giggled cruelly, pulling out her phone to record the humiliation. Other phones emerged from pockets and purses around the room. The red recording lights blinked like predatory eyes. David looked around, feeling trapped in the glare of 100 privileged stares. He saw pity in some eyes, amusement in others, but no one moved to intervene. They were all beholden to Jackson's influence in one way or another. A young pro-B firefighter named Tyler Collins, working the other side of the room, looked at David with desperate, embarrassed eyes, silently begging him to just walk away, to not make it worse. David took a deep breath, the smell of expensive lilies suddenly cloying in his throat. He started to unclasp his hands, ready to politely decline and retreat to the shadows, to swallow the humiliation just to end the scene. David began to take a step backward, his mouth opening to deliver the standard, de-escalating refusal that was part of his training. But the words died in his throat as his gaze drifted past Jackson's sneering face and locked onto an elderly woman sitting at a nearby table. She was watching him not with mockery, but with an intense, piercing sadness that felt strangely familiar. It was the same look his grandmother, Dorothy Martinez, used to give him in the months after Laura died. That look said, "You are still alive, but you are not living." In that split second, the memory of Laura Perez's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the noise of the ballroom. It wasn't a gentle memory. It was during a grueling practice session weeks before nationals, when his feet were bleeding and he wanted to quit. She had grabbed his face, sweating and fierce, and said, "David, dancing isn't about being pretty. It's about survival. It's about defying gravity when everything wants to pull you down." For 7 years, he had been shrinking. He had hidden behind the uniform, behind the grief, using the physicality of firefighting as a penance for having survived when she didn't. Jackson's insults calling him a brute, clumsy, just a body to carry. Things weren't just insulting him. They were insulting the art form Laura had loved, implying it was too good for someone like him. They were insulting the memory of the man he used to be with her. The heat in his neck changed from embarrassment to a cold, focused anger. Joshua Jackson was still laughing, turning to his entourage. "See," folded like a cheap suit. David stopped retreating. He squared his shoulders, the movement shifting the metals on his chest with a soft metallic clink that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet room. He looked directly into Jackson's watery, arrogant eyes. "I accept," David said. His voice wasn't loud, but it had the resonant timbre of a man used to issuing commands over the roar of a fire engine. Jackson blinked, his laughter dying in his throat. "Excuse me." I said, "I accept your wager, Mr. Jackson," David repeated, stepping fully into the light, his presence suddenly dominating the space. A Vienna's waltz, a murmur ran through the crowd. This was not the script. Sarah Thompson actually lowered her phone for a second, looking confused. "Are you serious?" "That remains to be seen." "Ma'am," David replied coolly. He turned his head toward the small stage where the orchestra was waiting. "But we do this right." He projected his voice toward the band leader. "Maestro Shostakovich, waltz number 2, the band." A grizzled old musician named Larry Green, who had seen everything in this ballroom, looked at the firefighter in the heavy dress blues, then back at the smug billionaire. A slow grin spread across Larry's face. He lifted his baton. "You heard the Lieutenant Shostakovich." Jackson looked momentarily unnerved by David's specific request, but quickly recovered his sneer. "Look at him, trying to sound cultured." He shoved Sarah forward roughly. "Go on, darling. Let him step all over your Prada shoes." Sarah looked horrified, but, fearing Jackson's temper more than crushed toes, stepped delicately onto the parquet floor. David approached her. The contrast was comical to many observers. Her in a shimmering silk gown that weighed nothing, him in thick wool trousers and heavy regulation leather safety boots that clomped against the wood. He was stiff, imposing, a statue in uniform. "Just try not to fall on me," Sarah hissed as he took her hand. His grip was firm, surprisingly professional, not the sweaty, nervous clutch she expected. "Just follow my lead, ma'am," David said, his voice devoid of emotion. He wasn't doing this for her, or even really to beat Jackson. He was doing this to prove to himself that Laura's husband had completely died in that fire. Larry Green brought the baton down. The haunting, driving melody of the saxophone began, the signature opening of Shostakovich's waltz. It was a difficult, fast-paced piece, demanding precision, stamina, and a flowing grace that seemed impossible for a man dressed for a funeral procession. For the first 4 bars, David just stood there, holding Sarah in frame, letting the rhythm sink into bones that hadn't felt a downbeat in 7 years. Jackson let out a loud, barking laugh. "He's frozen, I told you." Then, on the 5th beat, David moved. It wasn't a shuffle. It wasn't a tentative step. It was an explosion of controlled energy. He stepped into a natural turn, his heavy boot gliding across the floor with shocking lightness. He swept Sarah into the rotation, his frame rock solid, guiding her with a subtle power that made her gasp. The torque he generated was immense, yet his upper body remained perfectly still, a serene counterpoint to the rapid, intricate footwork happening beneath. The ballroom gasped collectively. A wine glass dropped somewhere and shattered, ignored. They weren't watching a clumsy firefighter. They were watching a master technician who just happened to be wearing a uniform. David closed his eyes for a second. He wasn't in the plaza anymore. He was back in the dusty rehearsal studio in Chicago, Laura in his arms, her laughter matching the music. The muscle memory, dormant for so long, fired back to life with agonizing intensity. He remembered the shift of weight, the counterbalance, the rise and fall. Despite the heavy wool, despite the steel-shanked boots that should have made this impossible, he was flying. He spun Sarah into a series of rapid fast rotation in the center of the floor that required perfect balance. Sarah, an experienced social dancer herself, realized with shock that she was the one struggling to keep up. He was holding her up, covering her mistakes, making her look better than she ever had. Jackson's face went from smugness to slack-jawed disbelief, and then to a mottled, purple rage. He was losing control of the room. People were no longer looking at him. They were mesmerized by the impossible grace of the man he had called a brute. The phones were back up, but now they weren't recording the humiliation. They were capturing a miracle. Joshua Jackson couldn't stand it. The humiliation was reversing itself rapidly. He strode toward the edge of the dance floor, his voice rising above the music. "All right, that's enough! Stop! You're doing it wrong." He was shouting nonsense, desperate to break the spell. When the music didn't stop, he grabbed a half-full champagne flute from a passing waiter's tray and, with a spiteful flick of his wrist, hurled the contents onto the floor directly in David's path. It was a cowardly, dangerous move, designed to guarantee a slip. Sarah saw it and tensed, ready to fall. The liquid slicked the wood instantly. David, deep in the rotation, saw the shimmer on the floor a fraction of a second before his boot hit it. It's amazing how we sometimes bury our deepest passions because of grief or fear, isn't it? Have you ever had something you loved that you gave up because life got too heavy, only to realize later it was the one thing that could help you heal? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. If you're enjoying this journey of rediscovery and justice, consider subscribing to the channel to join our growing family. David's lead boot hit the patch of champagne. Under normal circumstances, in those boots, on that polished floor, it should have been a catastrophic fall. He should have taken Sarah Dow with him in a tangle of silk and wool. But David Miller wasn't just a firefighter. He was a champion who had spent years training to recover from missteps. As his heel lost traction, his core engaged instantly, a reflex honed by years of balancing Laura's weight against his own. Instead of fighting the slip, he rode it. He turned the potential disaster into a dramatic, sweeping lunge, dipping Sarah low to the ground in a breathtaking, albeit improvised, flourish. It was a move of pure athletic desperation that looked entirely intentional. The crowd roared, thinking it was part of the choreography. Sarah, breathless and exhilarated by the near miss, clung to him. David used the momentum of the lunge to power back up, spinning out of the wet patch and right back into the rhythm of the Shostakovich waltz without missing a single beat. Jackson looked like he had swallowed glass. His sabotage had only made the performance more spectacular. He looked around for support, but the faces that had been sycophantic minutes ago were now rapt, focused entirely on the dance floor. Even his own junior partners were holding up their phones, recording the Firefighter. The music built to its crescendo. David, fueled by adrenaline and a strange, painful liberation, led Sarah into a final series of dizzying turns across the diagonal of the room, ending exactly on the final crashing chord with a sharp, perfectly executed bow while twirling Sarah into a graceful curtsy. The silence that followed lasted only a heartbeat, just long enough for David to straighten up and release Sarah's hand politely. Then the ballroom erupted. It wasn't polite golf clapping, it was a standing ovation. People were cheering, whistling. The young probie, Tyler Collins, was pumping his fist, beaming with pride. David felt unsteady, his breath coming hard, the wool uniform suddenly unbearably hot. The reality of what he had just done crashed down on him. He had exposed the part of himself he held most sacred to a room full of strangers. Sarah Thompson stared at him, wide-eyed and flushed. "My God," she breathed, forgetting her fiancé entirely. Before David could answer, a stern voice cut through the applause. He learned it in Chicago, dancing with his wife, Laura Perez. Karen Gonzalez, the formidable 70-year-old event organizer who had hired the security detail, stepped out of the crowd. She held up a tablet, displaying an old photo of a much younger, smiling David and Tails, dipping a beautiful woman in a sequined dress, holding a large trophy. "I recognized you the moment I saw the roster, David," she said softly. "I knew Laura." The revelation rippled through the room. The whispering changed tone completely. It wasn't just a surprising talent anymore. It was a tragedy. Joshua Jackson, seeing his control evaporate completely, tried to salvage the situation with bluster. He pushed his way toward David, his face sweating. All right. Very entertaining circus trick. You made your point. You used to dance." He pulled out a checkbook, his hands shaking slightly with rage. "Here's your money for the widows." David looked at the checkbook as if it were contaminated. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by an icy calm. He didn't want this man's money. He didn't want anything from him. "Keep it," David said, his voice flat. Jackson froze. "Excuse me, it's a $250,000. My captain, Samuel Mitchell, is here somewhere," David said, scanning the room until he found his superior, who looked stunned but fiercely proud. "He can talk to you about donations if you genuinely want to make one. But I don't want your bet money, Mr. Jackson." He took a step closer to the billionaire, who instinctively leaned back. "You think everything in this world is bought and sold?" David's eyes were hard. "I danced tonight because 7 years ago I stopped living. I let grief convince me that I was only good for carrying heavy things and fighting fires. Tonight, you tried to make me feel small, to make yourself feel big." He glanced at Karen Gonzalez, then back to Jackson. "And for the record," David added, a dry, humorless smile touching his lips, "I believe the terms of the wager stated that if I succeeded, you would marry me. I'm afraid I'll have to decline that offer as well." A wave of genuine laughter swept the room, this time directed entirely at Joshua Jackson. The billionaire realized he was completely isolated. Even Sarah had moved away from him, standing closer to Karen. The phones were still recording, capturing his complete social dismantling. David turned his back on Jackson. He walked over to Karen, who looked at him with tear-filled eyes. She would have been so proud of that recovery on the slip. "David," she whispered. "Thank you, Karen," David said, his voice thick with emotion. He walked toward the exit, his heavy boots once again sounding loud on the marble floor. But this chimney, the sound wasn't clumsy. It was the sound of a man walking with purpose. As he pushed open the heavy brass doors to the New York night, he took a deep breath of cool air. It didn't smell like smoke and ashes anymore. It smelled like possibilities. 3 weeks later, Jackson sat alone in his empty apartment. Sarah had left him, and his reputation was in tatters. Meanwhile, David was in a small studio with 15 students, including a woman named Brenda Walker. "David Miller," he introduced himself. "Dancing isn't about perfection." As he taught, he saw an arrogant man, Eric King, try to bully a receptionist, Kimberly White. David stepped in. "Money doesn't buy the right to maltreat people," he told him firmly. He realized dignity comes from within. "Thank you for being part of this story today. We would love to have you as a permanent part of our community. Please subscribe for more heartwarming stories of justice and redemption." We'd love to know, which city are you watching from? And what did you learn from David's journey tonight? Let us know in the comments.